Hi, and welcome to the latest edition of the H-Files, where we call the Human Hacking Files. I'm Patrick Harr, I'm the CEO of SlashNext, and I'm here to talk about, I've actually invited one of my esteemed colleagues, a very smart gentleman in the security space, to talk about devious phishing campaigns using Microsoft 365 tools. And as we've done in the previous H-Files, this is really going to be a storyline of an actual attack that we see, not just in the labs, but really see out in the wild. And it's been highly successful in terms of really infiltrating a company, taking over accounts, taking over effectively logins. And I should note, even if MFA, as we have seen in the industry of late over this last 3 weeks, even using things like identity-based management or MFA, multi-factor authentication, are things that do not stop these type of attacks. And the other key thing we're going to focus on today is how these effectively these bad actors are using what's called legitimate service compromise or legitimate services. And in this case, Microsoft 365 tools, which are very popular in the effectively this new remote working, hybrid work, modern workforce that everyone's using today, whether that be Teams, whether that be SharePoint, whether that be Outlook or the email component, or even OneNote. And I should also add OneDrive as well. There's multiple tools inside the Microsoft suite, but effectively what we're seeing is that a lot of the bad actors are now using those legitimate services, compromising those legitimate services to launch their attacks. So I expect this to be a pretty exciting, again, this is the land of the strange, the wild, and in this case, the reality of what we're seeing in the market. So as I mentioned, I have Casey Lee, who's a solutions engineer here at SlashNext. Casey, welcome.
Thank you.
As I said, Casey's the smart one here and is really going to be able to dive in and highlight some of the unique things that he's seeing. Again, we are seeing as an actual attack. As we always do, we want to kind of first start with what kind of the business impact of phishing. And I should just step back here for a moment, and because there's a lot of stats out there, but if you really look at even just the recent attacks, whether that be Okta, whether that be some of the highly visible ones that happened with some key, very, very large multinational companies, they started with a phish. And I should note here that these phishing attacks have become not just very generic spray and pray, where I kind of put out one attack and send it out to several million folks. It is actually very, very targeted attack that has some a priori knowledge about you as an individual, where you work, who you work for. There's a lot of research that goes in. And second, as this particular H-file is going to focus on, these attacks are coming from legitimate services. So they come from SharePoint.com, they come from Outlook, they come from the Microsoft 365 tools. And so if you really think about it, how do you train users to look at a domain that actually is very legitimate? It says SharePoint.com //. And so when you see the screen, you see the page, it's obviously something that people interact with because they trust those type of sites. And so with that, obviously, we've seen a very effective increase in phishing campaigns. And there's multiple ways people talk about phishing, whether that be spear-phishing, smishing, whaling, different techniques. But at its core, it's how do I compromise the human? And in many respects, humans are the weakest link in any security posture now, particularly as everyone's remote, distracted. In that context, the bad actors know they're remote, they know they're distracted. And most importantly, they know that, again, a priori knowledge, so they have some intimate basis to get that person to engage. And in turn, that's what leads to all evil. And as these stats highlight, 67% of threats missed by Microsoft are Credential stealing phishing emails. And so this is really important. If you look at the current, many folks out there now have Microsoft 365 and all the great tools. They have the security tools built in as well. So those are typically ATP Defender. It's got safe links. It's got, again, whether that's in your E3 license with the email aspects or the additional security tools, or it's E5. Bottom line, there's a significant number of missed attacks inside that suite. Second, as you see here, the average total cost of a credential compromise attack is 2.1 million. This is the latest research from the Ponemon Institute. I should also note here, it's about $1,500 per employee. That's a successful breach. So very, very impactful. Why are there a lot of bad actors? Why is this increased? The reason being, it's very profitable, because in many respects, it either leads to financial fraud and exchange of payments, or it leads to ransomware, right? Or it leads to data theft. So very successful industry in many respects. There's ransomware as a service. There's also phishing as a service, right? Very, very profitable businesses. And that's what leads to that final stat. 60% of all ransomware breaches involve the direct install using stolen credentials. So if they get access to your credentials, that's how you lay in the ransomware traps and effectively exfiltrate. As I mentioned, legitimate service compromise, or in this case, use of Microsoft tools to launch attacks, is very significantly on the rise. So in 2021 alone, we saw a 57% increase in the number of these attacks. And I should note here, and this is very, very important, one attack can have basically 100,000 children. And what I mean by that is the bad actors will create one very, very legitimate service attack inside of Outlook.com or SharePoint.com. And at SharePoint.com///, that's where that next attack is. So as I mentioned, you can't necessarily train users to look at the domain and say, wait, is there something wrong here? And in that context, that one attack, right, that is very well crafted, they could spawn, as I mentioned, 100,000 children. And what I mean by that, they'll create a unique link to that particular attack that targets you as that particular user. They know some information about that. So when you look at that, you can almost magnify this by another 100 times in the number of attacks that are out there, because every link effectively becomes its own attack that links back to this legitimate service compromise. And so in this particular case, as I mentioned in the H files, we like to walk through a particular storyline of how bad actors are using phishing to gain access to credentials, to lay in ransomware, to lay in software for the next attack. So in this particular case, in the last H files, we talked about how do you compromise an account? How do you gain trust upstream in a supply chain attack? So effectively, I'm a customer or supplier of, in this case, this particular company. So I've already gained legitimate access upstream. And so now what's that next kind of step that folks are taking once they've done the account compromise? And so in this case, again, very, very quick workflow here of what the bad actor's doing. So the company is obviously they're masquerading as a trusted user. There was already some a priority communication chain that's occurred, and they've targeted the victim with another phishing attack. The second phase of this is the victim. So they send a trusted email with a link. In this case, it's a compromised SharePoint domain, SharePoint link, SharePoint site. And so the user clicks on that, obviously. So they've got this trust relationship. In this case, the third step's a page redirects to the attacker's malicious domain. Voila, right? Once that happens, they then put up the login page. Again, it's a Microsoft, very well formed Microsoft 365 login page. In this case, they again compromise that particular user with their username and password. And now they're in the second company. Now they have legitimate access to the services inside whatever that user had access to. So those victims, obviously credentials are compromised. And the next step obviously is to lay the next phase of the attack, whether that's to put ransomware in, spyware. In this case, it was ransomware. So again, just to recap, in this particular storyline, what we're going to talk about, and Casey's going to dive into very significant detail, is that the company was already effectively upstream. There was legitimate service compromise or account compromise, trusted relationship gained, sent an email with a link, in this case, again, a SharePoint link that was compromised to the next user. That victim was obviously compromised with their credentials, and that opened up the keys to the kingdom, as they like to say. So with that, again, kind of as a backdrop, Casey, I'm going to let you walk through this in a little bit further detail and actually highlight some of the intricacies of in this case, what this bad actor did.
Okay, let's go through the attack. So if you've shared a file on OneDrive or any other productivity attachments, this email body might look familiar. because this is what is sent when you share a file with someone in Microsoft, if you add the email address on that share option. So as an attacker, this is an incredibly appealing strategy because it skips the step of having to create false communication between yourself and your target. You already know there is a relationship between your compromised domain that you're using and your target. So you can leverage SharePoint to conduct these attacks, because by sharing the file that will eventually lead to the credential stealing attack, that's going to be sent from Microsoft. And that's going to seem to be much more trusted than here's this link, press this attachment. There are more sophisticated, but looking at this, that's going to seem the most trusted way to open this link, feeling that this is going to be safe. Not only is it going to be a SharePoint file, but this was shared through their account, showing up from this compromised user. So opening it up will visit that compromised domain. So this is going to be the compromised SharePoint. Then once they visit that SharePoint site, they're going to be able to click download here, or it's going to be to view the file. And the second they click on that, it's going to exit SharePoint, and we're going to see a credential stealing page that looks a lot like this. And I think along with the increase of legitimate service abuse, there's also been a huge increase in spear phishes. And it's no longer where you can see the name of the user they're spear phishing in the URL. It's going to be hidden behind slashes, different codes to hash to show up as that user. Because when they visit that site, it's going to have their username pre-populated.
And I think that's pretty important, right, Casey? This is that prepopulation, say that a few times, has really increased the victims, right? Because it's already there, there's trust, they already gained. In this case, it's pre-populated. So users just by default almost go in and put their password, even if, and I should highlight, even if MFA was in place, right? So this is very important. As all of us have seen, let's call it the identity guru out there, right? Identity management guru in Okta, obviously got compromised, and there's a lot of speculation out there as exactly what happened. But it does look like there was human compromise involved at the outset. So again, even if you have MFA in place, do not trust that as a way just to prevent this type of attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's extremely effective to have that first step in SharePoint, because you're establishing a relationship that you're using Microsoft tools to collaborate. So if you're already going through the workflow of receiving a legitimate, well, an email that did come from sharing a file in SharePoint to visiting a compromised SharePoint account, it doesn't seem that reasonable at this step to enter in your credentials, especially if your email was already pre-populated. So incredibly convincing for the target. So once they enter in that password, they can either continue the cycle, what we've seen before of compromised attacks, or begin to focus on ransomware, spyware, or target other high-value victims within that specific organization. This could have been just one step to get in based on prior information, and then they can spread it out within the organization.
Yeah, in many respects, Casey, any good stories, in some respects, a short story is a great story. And so obviously, I think what you've highlighted here is a pretty simple process, but it's highly effective because again, they already gained trust. That trusted relationship was used to compromise the next victim. In that case, again, they used the legitimate service SharePoint to compromise and create that trust, that further trust, because they're already in that chain of communication. In that case, obviously gave up their username and password. So now they have a second credential to do the next stage. And this, again, in this case, it was a lay-in ransomware, but as you can see, they can do a number of these type of things, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with this, in some respects, Casey, what do you recommend that that folks do?
Well, I think there needs to be a huge emphasis on education and defense to look out for these attacks. I mean, there's two different ways of approaching it. And one would be to lock down everything related to the shared files, but that's going to impact productivity. It's going to annoy users. It's going to establish difficult communications when you're working with vendors who want to use their shared services. So I think the best way to handle this is to have a defense system that is able to detect services on legitimate infrastructure.
Yeah, perfect. So in many respects, as you mentioned, there is still very, very strong importance to do security awareness training, obviously to educate users on the types of attacks. But I think in that context, that security awareness training has to add this component of don't trust anything, verify everything. And what we mean by that, because they are coming from SharePoint, because they're coming from Outlook.com, Microsoft.com, all the Teams aspect where you have trust, don't trust the domains, don't trust the site. I know it's hard to put that on the user, and that's the reason why we have obviously advocate tools as well. Not only do you want to educate and train, but you actually also want to implement an offensive and a defensive strategy. And what we mean by that, there's certain techniques and ways to actually dynamically look at these things with using the latest AI techniques, right? Artificial intelligence, machine learning, to actually dynamically examine these very trusted, what are considered trusted domains, but really look inside, are they trusted or not? And in many respects, that's a great way to prevent users from interacting them with these attacks, because there is no amount of training in the world that will actually prevent these legitimate service compromises. And the reason for that, again, I go back to how think of your own daily life right now. You're working from home, you're distracted, you've got these phones, you get an SMS that also may have a smish. Then you go back to do your thing and you do something else. So that distracted nature is exactly what these folks are preying on. And we can put up side-by-side pages from these legitimate services. One is legitimate and one's using the legitimate service, but it's a compromise. Look, smell exactly the same. There's no way from the human eye to even discern this. And so that's the reason why you do want to put in tools that also effectively have the ability to look deep inside, do comparative analysis, computer vision, natural language processing, as well as behavioral analysis. Because one other thing I'll note here that it's become very popular in these bad actor world. They're also adding, as an example, HTML attachments that obfuscate links inside of these attachments. And in certain cases, depending on who you are, if you're a high value target and you live in this location, it'll actually open and resolve. If you're in another area, it'll actually just be, it's benign. So they've developed really good evasive techniques. And unless you're using a combination of training and tools, you're not going to be effective. And the final thing I would note here that's very, very important, you do need to make sure you're using, again, these tools that incorporate the latest artificial intelligence, machine learning, because you cannot rely on 99% of the tools out there that were built for email security, as an example, the likes of Prepopulation, the likes of Mimecast, Barracuda, et cetera, that do not use the latest techniques to identify these trusted domain, these legitimate service attacks. Again, unless you're doing that, they're going to miss them. And that's the reason why it's very common in many of the instances we work with companies. If they have Microsoft 365, and even if they have E3 and E5 and the entire Microsoft security tool set, they'll miss about 65% of these legitimate service compromises. Again, very, very critical to use in combination of both the training and the tools. And that's exactly what we do. And we obviously don't like to ever do commercials, but obviously do get one plug for what we do here at SlashNext. And we are exclusively focused on stopping, get back to effectively this human scourge, right? These human compromise attacks that are inundating everyday lives of not just the business, but the personal lives and professionals. And we do this with what we call SlashNext Complete, where we have the capability to basically surround the user with those tools to protect them, not just in email, but also in their mobile phone, their mobile world, and then in their browser. And why is the browser important? It's because over half the attacks are coming outside of email and all the other communication channels. And in many respects, what you want to make sure you're implementing, this just was recently reaffirmed by Gartner, you want to put in place a multi-channel phishing defense or phishing protection strategy. Don't just protect email. In many respects, we like to say, if you think about a house, if you just protect the front door, the rats still get in, right? The rats are going to come through any crack, any hole in your particular house, whether it be the back door, the side windows, some crack in the foundation. And if you're not protecting or surrounding that entire house, you're going to miss a lot of these new attacks. And believe you me, again, whether it's the latest smish that says call your IT department immediately, doesn't even have anything but a phone number, or it is that email, that exact thing that we just highlighted in this particular H file, unless you're putting in these proactive tools, you're going to be susceptible. And in fact, in our email case, within 5 minutes, we can literally highlight all the stuff that's being missed. Again, in many respects, I like to say there's a challenge that we have within 5 minutes of basically connecting to the Microsoft API and Microsoft 365. We'll show you exactly what's being missed. And it's very, very eye-opening. And you think you're protected and you're not. If you go back to that financial impact and what's important, again, up to $1,500 per employee for every successful phishing breach. Think about that for a moment. If you're a 10,000 person company, or even if you're a 1,000 person company, that's a very expensive proposition because you're getting into the millions of dollars when you get into remediation. So think about that for a moment. And in some respects, these tools, our tools, other tools that are kind of these latest, greatest things to stop these things are a very effective insurance policy to prevent these type of attacks. And so, and why SlashNext? Again, that quick time to value. We really pride ourselves to make sure within 5 minutes you have protection in email. And again, I would say take that challenge. You can try it risk-free. You go on the site and you can you basically sign up. And again, I kid you not, within 5 minutes, you're going to have the ability to protect and you're going to actually see things light up. We did this with one company, and in the process where they installed it, within that 15-minute period, they actually showed attacks to the CFO. What we call 0-hour attacks, meaning there were unique attacks for that particular CFO, very difficult to discern. So extremely strong, basically that time to value is what we'd like to say is very strong with us. High accuracy, really pride ourselves on not only what we find, but with the false positive rate. So we have a 99.9% detection rate and 1 in 1 million false positive. Ease of use is critical. Last thing you want to do is put a tool in. It takes a hell of a lot of time to manage it, maintain it. Whitelists are not great anymore. In fact, I'd say any tool that requires to maintain huge whitelists, don't do it. We want to reduce the administrative time, not add more administrative burden. In many respects, any good security strategy is a layered security strategy, and that's exactly what this does. And finally, leave you with nothing else, make sure you're protecting the entire house. The multi-channel coverage is very important. In this case, with Microsoft 365, you don't want to just cover the email. You want to cover SharePoint, you want to cover Teams, you want to cover OneDrive, all the productivity tools. And for those that use Slack, for those that use any of the N number of communication vehicles inside your corporation, protect all those tools because that's where the bad actors are coming. And finally, I would note, you also want to protect the personal channels for your employees. Why is that important? You may use the same username and password in Signal, WhatsApp, LinkedIn. And in one of the H files, we actually showed how they compromised the CEO or impersonated a CEO to then break in, do what's called a crossover lateral move. So it's, again, you can try this risk-free. Takes 5 minutes on that first install in the email. And again, I think you really like what you're going to see. So with that, I think we really like to schedule these things in 30 minutes. So we're actually going to answer the questions that we have offline and get back to you. And we're also going to make this available as always on our other channels so for those that were not able to join us live, they're going to be able to see this on their own leisure. I'm a big podcast fan. So with that, Casey, I wanted to thank you for joining us, walking us through that attack. And as always, we will see you on the next H-Files.